Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take stacks of global data, complex reports, and really try to turn them into, well, structural knowledge you can actually use.
And today, we've got a really critical mission ahead of us.
We certainly do. We're unpacking the brand new 19th edition of the Global Peace Index, the GPI. It's the big flagship report from the Institute for Economics and Peace, the IEP.
Yeah, and this report, the GPI, it's really seen as the gold standard, for measuring peacefulness globally. The findings this year, well, they're honestly more alarming than we've seen in decades.
Okay, let's just quickly set the stage on what the GPI actually is for anyone new to it.
Right, so it ranks 163 independent countries. That covers something like 99.7% of the world's population. It's huge coverage.
And it does that using specific data points.
Exactly. It uses 23 different indicators, and these are grouped into three main areas, or domains, as the IEP calls them.
Which are?
Okay, so you've got societal safety and security, then ongoing domestic and international conflict, and the third one is militarization.
Got it. So 3 core buckets for measuring peace. And our mission today, as you said, is critical because this report, well, it paints a pretty concerning picture. Well, we need to get beyond just the headlines and really dig into what this huge data set tells us about the structural reasons why global peace seems to be slipping away.
That's the key word, structural. The main finding is pretty stark. Global peacefulness has deteriorated again for the 6th year in a row.
6th year. That's a trend, not a blip. And you mentioned something truly shocking before we started about conflict precursors.
Yes, that's maybe the most alarming part. Many of the factors that historically signal major instability, things like economic stress, political tension, social fragility, these are now at their highest levels since the end of World War II.
Wow. Since World War II. That really puts it in perspective.
It absolutely does. It's just we're not just in a rough patch with a few more conflicts. The data points towards a systemic shift, a fundamental move towards greater instability globally.
And the actual number for this year's decline?
The average level of peacefulness across all countries fell by 0.36% in 2025.
Okay, 0.36% might sound small to some listeners. Why is that figure so significant?
Well, it's the breadth of the decline. More countries got less peaceful than got more peaceful. And when you see that combined with the long-term trend and those WWII-level precursors, it signals a really profound shift in how the world works. We're entering an era where conflicts are, well, more common, deadlier, and crucially, much, much harder to actually resolve.
Okay, let's look at the long view then. The GPI goes back, 17 years now? 2008 to 2025.
That's right, a 17-year perspective.
So if it feels like the world is getting more dangerous, more conflict-ridden, how does that square with the 3 domains? Did any of them improve long-term? Where is the peace actually, leaking from?
Right, that's a good question. The linkage, as you put it, is heavily concentrated in the domain that tracks direct violence. So since 2008, 2 of those 3 domains have gotten significantly worse.
Which ones?
The domain tracking ongoing conflict, that's seen a truly staggering fall in peacefulness, down 17.5%.
17.5%. That's huge.
It is. It's the steepest decline we track across any domain. And it basically shows this massive increase in both how often wars are happening and how intense they're becoming.
Okay, so ongoing conflict is way down. What was the other one that deteriorated?
Societal safety and security. That also got worse, but by a more modest 2.5% over that same period since 2008.
Right. Now, the third one, militarization. This seems counterintuitive. Didn't you say that one actually improved long-term? How is that possible if things feel like they're heating up?
Yeah, it did. Militarization did show a long-term improvement of 2.7% since 2008. But, and this is a really critical but, you have to understand why.
Good.
That long-term improvement was largely driven by things that happened earlier in that period. Think post-Cold War drawdowns in the size of armies, fewer armed services personnel overall, and interestingly, a steady decrease in funding for UN peacekeeping operations for quite a while.
So a kind of peace dividend effect left over from a previous era.
Sort of, yeah. It reflected a period, maybe after 9/11, but before the last few years, where defense spending outside immediate war zones was relatively contained. But, and here's the cut to that positive trend, it's definitively over now.
How?
It has completely reversed in just the last 4 years. We're now seeing this pervasive global drive towards rearmament. So the long-term number masks a very worrying recent trend.
Okay, that makes more sense. Let's dig into the conflict metrics themselves. The deterioration there sounds, frankly, terrifying.
Yeah.
What specific indicators really tell this story about modern war?
Well, the specific numbers are pretty stark. Since 2008, the indicator that tracks external conflicts fought, so wars fought outside a country's own borders, that has deteriorated by a massive 63.5%.
63.5%. Just wow.
And the measure for internal conflicts fought civil wars,
Right.
essentially that's deteriorated by 45%.
So both up significantly.
Hugely. It confirms what many suspect. Conflict isn't just more frequent, it's also becoming way more internationalized. Countries getting involved in fights beyond their own territory. That's really a defining feature of the complexity we see now.
You mentioned internationalized conflict, the sheer number of wars. I read it's the highest since World War II.
That's correct. The report tracks 59 active state-based conflicts currently. That's 3 more than last year. And the really dangerous trend within that is the internationalization you just mentioned.
How many countries are involved outside their borders?
78. 78 countries are now engaged in some form of conflict beyond their own borders.
78. That's almost half the countries ranked.
It is. And think about the change over time that represents a stunning 175% increase in these internationalized interstate conflicts just since 2010.
So basically, local civil wars are increasingly becoming global proxy wars.
That's exactly what it means. We are absolutely living in an era defined by global proxy warfare.
And if these conflicts are so heavily internationalized, fueled by outside powers, proxies, external interests, I mean, that must make them almost impossible to actually solve using traditional diplomacy or negotiation, right?
You've hit the nail on the head. That's precisely what the data shows. There's been a collapse in the effectiveness of conflict resolution mechanisms.
How do we know that? What does the data say about how wars end?
Well, the IEP looked at how conflicts have ended historically. Back in the 1970s, for instance, nearly half, 49%, ended in a decisive military victory for one side, and another 23% ended with some kind of negotiated peace agreement.
Okay, so back then, most wars actually ended one way or another.
Right. Now, fast forward to the 2010s, conflicts ending in a decisive victory, that plummeted to just 9%.
Only 9%.
And peace agreements, even worse, they collapsed to just 4%.
4%. So if victory is rare, and peace deals are even rarer, how do most conflicts end today? Nearly 70% of them, you said.
They end. Or rather, they pause due to what the GPI calls low activity.
Low activity, what does that mean?
It basically means the fighting dies down enough that battle deaths drop below 25 in a calendar year. But, and this is crucial, the underlying reasons for the conflict, the political disputes, the ethnic tensions, the fights over resources, they remain completely unresolved.
So the fire just goes down to embers, but it's not actually out.
Precisely. Nearly 70% of conflicts in the 2010s ended this way. And what this does is create these persistent frozen conflicts. They're just simmering disputes ready to flare up again the moment there's a shift in local politics or, more likely, geopolitical maneuvering. It guarantees ongoing instability.
That makes the world feel like a minefield, just waiting for the next trigger. Looking just at this past year, the very latest data, what specific indicators drove the overall drop in peacefulness?
The biggest year-on-year deteriorations were seen in 3 main areas. First, external conflicts fought that continue to get worse. Second, deaths from internal conflict also rose significantly. And third, reflecting that rearmament trend we talked about, military expenditure as a percentage of GDP saw a major negative impact on the score.
So the global reach of conflict, its lethality, and the investment in future conflict, they're all spiking at the same time.
Exactly. It's a worrying combination.
Okay, amidst all this pretty heavy news, I have to ask, were there any bright spots? You mentioned the safety and security domain deteriorated less severely long-term. Did any domestic trends maybe buck this global gloom?
Surprisingly, yes, there were a couple. The average global homicide rate, believe it or not, is now at its lowest level since the GPI first started.
Really? Lowest ever?
Yeah, it's continuing a long-running improvement trend, particularly in most advanced economies, but even in some developing ones too. And relatedly, people's perceptions of criminality in their local area also improved slightly on average.
Okay, so let's street crime lower homicide rates. That's genuinely good news.
It is, but, and it's a vital caveat, the sheer scale of the increase in organized violence, particularly state-based conflict and these internationalized wars, completely swamps those small, localized domestic gains in safety.
So individual safety might be slightly up in some places, but the risk from large-scale organized violence is way, way up.
That's the picture. State violence and interstate conflict are now the primary drivers of global instability, much more so than, say, everyday crime.
Right. Let's shift focus geographically for a moment. The Middle East and North Africa, MENA now, That region seems to be perpetually at the bottom of the rankings.
It is. For the 10th consecutive year, MENA remains the least peaceful region globally. That's largely driven by the extreme volatility we see in Palestine, the absolute devastating civil war in Sudan, and the sort of enduring fragmentation and violence in Syria.
But was there one country anywhere in the world that saw a particularly shocking single-year drop in this latest report?
Yes, there was. And interestingly, it wasn't in MENA. The most dramatic negative shift in the 2025 GPI was actually in Asia. Bangladesh recorded the largest deterioration in peacefulness of any country.
Bangladesh. How big a drop are we talking?
It was substantial. They fell 33 places in the global rankings, and their overall peacefulness score dropped by 13%. That's a huge hit for 1 year.
13%. What on earth caused that kind of rapid, severe decline?
It was primarily driven by large-scale internal upheaval. The country went through a period of widespread civil unrest, very violent political demonstrations, and significant political instability that tragically led to mass fatalities.
So, internal political breakdown.
Exactly. It really demonstrates just how fragile domestic peace can be, even in countries not involved in major external wars. When political systems fracture like that, the cost in human lives and overall stability is immediate and severe. It can push a nation right down the global rankings faster than almost anything else.
Okay, let's move to that bigger structural narrative you mentioned earlier. The GPI seems to confirm we're really entering what some call an age of fragmentation. This isn't just countries disagreeing more. It feels like the actual fabric of global cooperation is being, well, actively torn apart. How does this show up in the data?
Yeah, age of fragmentation feels about right. The data makes it pretty undeniable. And interestingly, the report suggests the level of geopolitical fragmentation now is actually exceeding what we saw even during the peak of the Cold War.
Higher than the Cold War. How do they measure that?
One key way is by tracking the quality of relationships between neighboring countries. That's a really fundamental indicator of regional stability. And the trend there is stark. Since 2008, 59 countries recorded poorer relations with their neighbors.
59 got worse. How many got better?
Only 19 saw improvement. So that's a 3-to-1 ratio tilted heavily towards decline. Neighbors are just not getting along as well as they used to, globally speaking.
And it feels like the biggest stabilizing force of the last half-century, economic interdependence, globalization, that's now being actively used as a weapon, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's a huge part of this fragmentation story. For decades, global trade as a percentage of global GDP just kept climbing, but it essentially plateaued around 60% after the 2008 financial crisis and hasn't really recovered that upward momentum.
And this plateau isn't just market forces.
No, the current slowdown or fragmentation is very much driven by deliberate policy choices. It's strategic. We're talking about things like the ongoing U.S.-China tariff disputes, the really extensive Western sanctions imposed on Russia after the Ukraine invasion, and these conscious policies of friendshoring or nearshoring supply chains.
Could you quickly explain friendshoring for listeners who might not have come across that term?
Sure. Friendshoring is basically when countries and companies decide where to put their investments in supply chains, not just based on cost or efficiency, but based on geopolitical alignment.
So you only trade or invest heavily with countries you consider reliable political allies, your friends.
Exactly. You prioritize perceived security and political reliability over pure economic logic. And while that might make sense from a risk management perspective for one country when everyone starts doing it, it actively accelerates global economic fragmentation. It builds rival economic blocs.
Right. And this kind of fragmentation, this breakdown in trust, it almost inevitably leads to increased militarization, doesn't it? When you trust your neighbors less, you tend to build bigger fences, or in this case, bigger armies.
That's the historical pattern, and it's exactly what we're seeing now. We already touched on that reversal in the militarization domain trend. The spending figures globally are just, well, they're staggering.
What's the headline number for global military spending?
Global military spending hit a new record high in 2024. It reached $2.7 trillion.
Yes, and that was a 9% increase just from the previous year. It's a huge jump. This spending surge is really widespread now, fueled obviously by the war in Ukraine, but also rising tensions in the Middle East and East Asia.
Yeah.
It's becoming a global phenomenon.
And it's not just conventional spending, right? What about nuclear? That's also a worrying aspect. The report notes that basically every nuclear-armed state has either maintained or actively expanded its nuclear arsenal since 2022. There's a renewed emphasis on nuclear capabilities, alongside competition in newer domains like AI-enabled drone warfare and counterspace capabilities. The arms race is back, and it's high-tech.
I also found this concept in the report really fascinating: global power fragmentation. It's not just about the US versus China or Russia anymore. There's a whole new layer of influential regional players emerging.
Yes, that's a really important shift in the global landscape. The number of what the IEP calls globally influential middle powers, these are nations with significant regional clout, but not quite superpower status. That number has nearly tripled since the end of the Cold War.
Tripled. From what to what?
It's gone from about 13 such powers back then to 34 by 2023.
Wow. And who are we talking about here? Countries like...
Think of nations like Turkey, the UAE, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, these kinds of countries. They have their own interests, their own foreign policies, and they're becoming much more active, particularly in places like Africa, South Asia, and Latin America.
And does their influence help or hinder peace?
It's mixed, honestly. Sometimes they can play a stabilizing role regionally, but often they're also pursuing their own rivalries or intervening in local conflicts in ways that really complicate peace efforts by the traditional major powers. It just adds another layer of complexity to resolving conflicts.
Okay, let's zoom in on Europe for a moment, because the data there seems to present a bit of a paradox when you compare NATO spending levels to, say, Russia's actual military capability.
Right. This is a really critical point, and one that often gets missed in, political debates about defense spending. The report highlights that 24 Western and Central European countries increased their military spending recently. This is what's driving the overall deterioration for Europe in that militarization domain score.
So on paper, European NATO members are spending a lot more.
Collectively, yes. They outspend Russia by a significant margin, just looking at the dollar figures. But, and this is the key, that financial advantage doesn't necessarily translate directly into a proportional advantage in actual military capability on the ground.
Why not? If you're spending more, shouldn't you get more? Where's the money going?
There are two main reasons for the discrepancy. The first is something called purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Okay, what's that?
It basically means that a dollar or a euro spent on defense buys you different amounts of actual military stuff depending on where you spend it. Military hardware, and especially personnel, costs salaries. Benefits are significantly lower in Russia than they are in high-wage Western European countries.
So Russia gets more bang for its buck, quite literally.
Essentially, yes. A ruble spent on defense in Russia buys more physical military capacity, more soldiers, more tanks for the money than a euro spent in, say, Germany or France. The second factor is how the money is allocated within the budgets.
How so?
Western defense budgets, particularly in Europe, tend to have a very large chunk, sometimes 50% or even more, allocated to non-combat costs. We're talking high salaries, very expensive legacy pension systems for retired personnel, maintaining extensive infrastructure, administrative overhead.
Stuff that doesn't directly translate into fighting power today.
Exactly. Whereas Russia's military, partly by design and partly due to its structure, tends to spend a much higher percentage of its budget directly on combat readiness, training, and new hardware. So the capability gap is often narrower than the spending gap would suggest.
Right. So Europe is spending more, getting maybe less immediate combat power per euro, and this increased military spending must come at a cost domestically, right? There's always a trade-off.
Absolutely. And that gets us to the real crunch point for domestic stability. When governments significantly ramp up military expenditure, that money has to come from somewhere. It inevitably crowds out potential investment in other areas that are really essential for long-term peace and social cohesion.
Like what?
Like education, healthcare, infrastructure that boosts economic productivity, the foundations of a healthy society. Given that many European nations are already grappling with sluggish economic growth, cost of living crises, aging populations, pouring ever more money into defense budgets risks fueling public discontent, social polarization, and potentially undermining the very internal stability they're trying to protect by building up external defenses. It's a real dilemma.
A classic guns versus butter dilemma, but on a massive scale. And that rising militarization, that huge $2.7 trillion global spending figure, that's the perfect lead-in to talk about the sheer cost of all this instability. If the world is spending that much just on the military side, the total economic burden of violence must be astronomical.
Astronomical is the right word. The cost is it's truly mind-boggling. The IEP calculates that the global economic impact of violence reached $19.97 trillion in 2024.
$0.97
Right.
trillion dollars. Let's
Yeah.
just pause on that. Nearly $20 trillion.
Yes. And that's measured in purchasing power parity, the PPP terms we just discussed, which actually makes it a conservative estimate in some ways, but allows for a fair comparison across countries with different price levels.
Okay, but $20 trillion. How does that compare to, say, the global economy?
It's equivalent to about 11.6% of the entire global GDP.
Almost 12% of everything the world produces.
Yeah.
Just lost to violence or containing violence.
Yep.
That's larger than the entire economy of China, just for perspective.
It is, or put it another way, it's about $2,455 for every single person on the planet.
$2,400 per person per year. And that cost went up from the previous year, too.
It did. It represents a 3.8% increase just from 2023. So the economic burden is growing.
How does that immense $20 trillion cost break down? Is it mostly like the cost of rebuilding destroyed cities or treating injuries, that kind of thing?
Actually, no. That's a common misconception. The vast majority of that cost isn't the direct consequence of violence, like damage or healthcare for victims. It's the cost of containment,
Containment.
meaning spending on military and internal security forces, police, prisons, etc. Together, military and internal security spending account for a whopping 73% of that total $20 trillion economic impact.
73% is just spending on armies and police forces.
Exactly. And military expenditure alone makes up $9 trillion of that. That's 45% of the entire economic cost of violence just on military budgets.
$9 trillion just on military spending.
Yeah.
We really have to stop and absorb that number. If humanity is spending $9 trillion every year just preparing for or engaging in conflict,
Yeah.
it feels like we're actively choosing to invest in the possibility of war over, well, almost anything else.
It absolutely reveals a profound global misallocation of resources. We'll definitely come back to that point. But first, it's crucial to understand that this enormous burden isn't shared equally.
No, I imagine the countries actually experiencing the worst conflicts bear a much higher cost.
Dramatically higher. And the 10 countries most affected by violence, think places like Afghanistan, Ukraine, Sudan, Syria, the economic cost of violence averaged 27.8% of their GDP.
Nearly a third of their entire economy just gone because of violence.
Yes. Compare that to the 10 least affected countries, the most peaceful ones. For them, the economic cost of violence was just 2.5% of GDP.
So the cost of instability falls overwhelmingly on the nations that are already the most fragile and least equipped to handle it.
Precisely. It creates a vicious cycle. Violence destroys economies, which makes recovery harder, which can breed more violence.
Okay, this brings us back to that resource allocation point. If we're spending $9 trillion just on the military component of containing violence, what are we spending on actually preventing violence, on building peace?
The comparison is, well, it's almost shameful, frankly. Global expenditure on peacebuilding and peacekeeping activities, things like mediation, development aid targeted at conflict prevention, reconciliation programs that totaled only $47.2 billion in 2024.
47
Wow.
billion with a B, compared to $9 trillion with a T for military spending.
Yes. That $47.2 billion is only 0.52%, about half of 1% of what the world spends on its military.
Half of 1%. That's an incredible gap.
It gets worse. That $47.2 billion figure, it actually represents a 26% decline in real terms, adjusted for inflation, since 2008.
So while military spending is skyrocketing, actual investment in peace building has been cut by over a quarter.
That's what the data shows. The world is structurally disinvesting in prevention while simultaneously pouring unprecedented resources into containment and conflict itself. It's a deeply worrying trend.
It certainly is. Now let's connect this economic cost back to the drivers of future conflict. The report talks about underlying macroeconomic pressures that are actively increasing the risk of instability around the world. This cost isn't just a consequence. It actually fuels the fire, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. These things create feedback loops. The current global economic environment is putting immense stress on many countries, but particularly on developing nations.
What are the main stressors?
Well, first, you've got fairly modest global GDP growth, projected around 3.3%, combined with inflation that's still stubbornly high, averaging 5.8% globally.
So slow growth plus high prices, a tough combination anywhere.
Exactly, but this combines really disastrously with the global debt crisis, which is hitting developing countries especially hard.
Right, the debt figures look terrifying in the summary.
They are. Global public debt reached $97 trillion in 2023. Now, for advanced economies with strong finances, that's generally manageable. But the problem is that debt in developing countries has been growing twice as fast as debt in advanced economies since about 2010.
Twice as fast. And they have less capacity to pay it back.
Much less. And the cost of servicing that debt is becoming paralyzing for many fragile governments. The report finds that, on average, economically developing countries are now spending 42% of their government revenue just on debt servicing.
42%. So nearly half of all the taxes they collect, all the money coming in, just immediately goes back out the door to pay interest and principal on loans.
That's the average. Imagine running a country where almost half your income is gone before you can even think about spending it on schools, hospitals, roads, or security.
It means they can't deliver basic services.
Often, yes. They frequently spend more just servicing their debt than they spend on crucial areas like health and education combined. This forces governments into really painful austerity measures, cutting subsidies, raising taxes, slashing public sector jobs, often dictated by creditors like the IMF.
And austerity measures tend to make populations angry.
Exactly. It directly fuels social backlash, protests, and political instability. We saw a really vivid example of this in Kenya in 2023. The government tried to implement tax hikes and cut fuel subsidies, largely to manage its debt burden and meet IMF conditions.
Yeah.
It immediately triggered mass protests across the country, many of which turned violent and deadly. The debt crisis isn't just an economic issue, it's becoming a profound driver of domestic instability and conflict risk worldwide.
Okay, beyond debt, what other major economic stressors are creating populations that might be more vulnerable to, say, mobilization for conflict?
High youth unemployment is another major factor. Globally, it's a concern, but it's particularly acute in regions like the Middle East and North Africa, MENA, where the youth unemployment rate is around 24.5%.
Wow, nearly 1 in 4 young people out of work.
Yes, and that's more than 10 percentage points higher than the global average. This creates this huge cohort of often educated but deeply frustrated and disaffected young people. They lack opportunities, they feel let down by the system.
And that makes them politically volatile.
Extremely volatile. They become much more susceptible to mobilization by populist leaders, extremist groups, or anyone offering a radical alternative or someone to blame. It's a classic ingredient for unrest.
Okay, debt, youth unemployment, any other key economic factors?
The final big structural stressor highlighted is the significant cuts we're seeing in official development assistance, or ODA, that's foreign aid, basically.
Aid is being cut at a time when these countries are facing debt crises and instability.
Yes, precisely when it's needed most, in many cases. The report points to some really drastic examples, like an estimated 83% reduction in U.S. USAID funding specifically allocated to sub-Saharan Africa in recent budgets.
83% cut. That's massive.
It's devastating. Cuts like that, especially if mirrored by other donors, immediately put essential services at risk in the most fragile states. We're talking basic healthcare clinics, food security programs, support for governance. When those things collapse due to funding cuts, it dramatically increases the likelihood that those states will descend into violence simply because the basic functions of the state are failing.
Okay, so we've established this worrying picture. More conflicts, often internationalized, and they rarely end decisively. Instead, they simmer down into these frozen conflicts, just waiting to reignite.
Exactly. That frozen state is inherently unstable.
So the crucial question then becomes, why do some of these simmering tensions or low-level conflicts suddenly explode into truly severe, high-intensity warfare while others don't? The IEP report identified specific factors for this, didn't they? These escalation factors. Right.
Yes, they did. The research team looked at historical and current conflicts to identify common factors that act like accelerants, things that significantly increase the likelihood that a conflict will rapidly escalate in intensity and lethality. They identified 9 major factors.
9 factors. They basically tell us where the risk is highest for things to go from bad to catastrophic very quickly.
That's a good way to put it. Maybe we can focus on 4 of the most critical ones that seem particularly relevant today.
Sounds good. Let's start with external support, which you've already highlighted is so widespread, with those 78 countries fighting outside their borders.
Right. External support is arguably the most critical driver of conflict escalation and protraction in the modern era. When outside powers, whether they're other states or sometimes powerful non-state groups, provide arms, money, training, logistical help, or even their own troops.
It changes the whole dynamic.
Completely. It almost always prevents one side from achieving a quick, decisive victory. It fuels the fighting, makes it much deadlier, and drags it out for far longer. Direct military intervention by external actors or extensive support for proxies is now the dominant mode. It essentially takes what might have been a containable local civil war and transforms it into an internationalized proxy conflict with much higher stakes and much greater bloodshed.
Okay, so external support is key. What about internal dynamics? The report mentions ethnic exclusion. How does that drive escalation?
This is about situations where the conflict lines map directly onto existing divisions between ethnic, religious, or perhaps linguistic groups, especially where one group feels systematically marginalized or oppressed by the state.
So the conflict becomes about identity, not just politics.
Exactly. It shifts from being a political dispute over policy or power into what feels like an existential struggle for the survival of the group itself. It becomes zero-sum. And crucially, regimes facing rebellion from a group they already view as other or inferior are far more likely to resort to extreme, disproportionate violence.
Why is that?
Because they often cease to distinguish between combatants and civilians within that group. They may view the entire community as complicit or as a threat, justifying indiscriminate attacks and collective punishment. We've seen this tragic pattern play out historically in places like the Guatemalan Civil War, with violence against indigenous populations, and more recently with the horrific targeting of civilians from specific ethnic groups in Sudan's Darfur conflict. Ethnic exclusion dramatically raises the risk of mass atrocities.
Grim. Okay, the next factor sounds deeply cynical. Conflict instrumentalization. What does that mean?
It is cynical. This refers to the calculated strategy of taking a relatively localized dispute, maybe a border skirmish, a fight over local resources, or a small insurgency, and deliberately framing it as part of a much larger, grander struggle.
How does that help escalate things?
Leaders use this tactic to advance broader goals. By painting a small fight as, say, a vital battle against foreign interference or a defense of national honor, or part of an ideological clash between good and evil, they can achieve several things. They can justify aggressive military action, mobilize popular support at home by appealing to nationalism or fear, and crucially, shut down space for negotiation or compromise by making the stakes seem too high.
Can you give an example?
The Kashmir dispute is a classic tragic example. Localized incidents, like terrorist attacks or border clashes, are consistently instrumentalized by both India and Pakistan to serve much larger nationalistic narratives and strategic objectives involving their nuclear rivalry. This keeps the entire situation perpetually volatile. Similarly, in places like Sudan, local conflicts over land or water might be deliberately recast by political actors along racial or ideological lines to incite wider violence and mobilize militias.
Using local pain for geopolitical gain.
Essentially, yes.
Okay, and the last of the 4 key factors you wanted to highlight is fratricidal coercion. That sounds particularly brutal.
It is. This describes a military or political strategy where a state, or sometimes a powerful non-state group like a rebel army, enforces discipline and compliance within its own ranks and often across the civilian population under its control, primarily through extreme harshness, terror, and the credible threat of severe punishment or execution for disobedience.
So, ruling by fear, basically, even within your own side.
Exactly. It's about ensuring absolute obedience, even to potentially criminal or suicidal orders. While this might create highly disciplined forces in one sense, it often does so at the cost of morale, initiative, and basic humanity. The report points to Eritrea's policy of indefinite national service, which includes compulsory military service, often under brutal conditions, as a form of institutionalized fratricidal coercion. It creates a large, controllable military force, but it also fosters a culture of fear and can lead to extreme brutality when those forces are deployed in conflict, because disobedience isn't tolerated.
These factors really paint a picture of how conflicts can spiral out of control. To make this concrete, let's look at a specific case study mentioned in the report. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC. There was a major escalation there during the period the GPI covers.
Yes, the DRC is a truly tragic, almost textbook example of several of these escalation factors converging with devastating consequences. In 2025, we saw a major escalation of the conflict in the east, particularly with the M23 rebel group launching large-scale offensives.
This wasn't just a small militia group causing trouble.
No, not at all. M23 managed to seize major urban centers like Goma and Bukavu. This wasn't a low-level insurgency. It was a sophisticated, well-equipped military campaign that resembled conventional warfare in many respects.
What allowed M23 to become so powerful? What turned this long-running conflict into such an acute crisis?
The absolutely decisive factor was external support. The evidence, including UN reports, strongly indicates that M23 received substantial and increasingly sophisticated backing, primarily from neighboring Rwanda.
What kind of back?
We're talking heavy weaponry tanks, advanced artillery, unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs or drones, and even sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems capable of threatening UN aircraft. This level of equipment transformed M23's capabilities.
So, Rwanda supporting M23. What about the DRC government forces?
They were struggling to respond effectively and became heavily reliant on external help too, but of a different kind. They increasingly turned to private military contractors, PMCs, mainly from Eastern Europe and South Africa, for training, advisory roles, and even direct combat support.
So you have external state support on one side and external private military support on the other. A classic proxy war scenario.
Exactly. A proxy-driven conflict fueled by external arms, money, and personnel. And the result on the ground was, and continues to be, a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. The sheer scale of displacement is hard to comprehend. The latest figures suggest over 7.8 million people are internally displaced within the DRC, largely due to this conflict.
7.8 million people. That's just staggering. So the DRC is clearly a major escalation hotspot. Where else does the report indicate these factors are creating particularly high-risk environments right now?
Based on these escalation factors, several other countries stand out. South Sudan is one. The revitalized peace agreement, the RARCSS, has largely collapsed. Violence is increasing again, and it's being made much worse by the spillover effects from the civil war raging next door in Sudan, things like refugee flows, shifting alliances, and importantly, a massive proliferation of weapons flooding across the border.
Okay, South Sudan. Where else?
Syria remains incredibly fragile. While the intense phase of the multi-sided civil war might be over, the country is deeply fragmented. You have ongoing low-level insurgencies, economic collapse, and the continued complex meddling of external powers, Russia, Iran, Turkey, the U.S., all vying for influence in different regions. The post-Assad future, whenever it comes, looks incredibly unstable, ripe for renewed conflict.
And you mentioned the tension between Ethiopia and Eritrea earlier.
Yes, that's another significant hotspot to watch. The core driver there is Ethiopia's stated determination to gain sovereign access to a port on the Red Sea, which its leadership has framed as an existential issue for the country's economic future and regional power status.
And Eritrea controls the coastline Ethiopia wants access to.
Exactly. Eritrea views its sovereignty over its ports as absolutely non-negotiable. This led to renewed tensions, military posturing, and troop mobilizations on both sides of the border in early 2025. This situation ticks several escalation boxes: potential for external actors to get involved, strong nationalist narratives instrumentalization, histories of ethnic tension, and states with coercive internal structures, fratricidal coercion. It's a very flammable mix.
We also have to touch on Kashmir again, given the stakes involved with two nuclear-armed powers.
Absolutely. Kashmir isn't necessarily seeing a massive new escalation right now compared to the DRC, but it represents an area where the potential for rapid escalation is chronically high because the underlying risk factors are always present.
Which factors specifically?
You have the challenge of logistical supply due to the difficult mountainous terrain, which can shape how conflicts are fought. You have persistent allegations and evidence of external support for militant groups operating from Pakistani territory. You have the ethnic exclusion dimension related to the status of Kashmiri Muslims and the Indian government's policies, like the revocation of Article 370. And you certainly have conflict instrumentalization, where both India and Pakistan use the issue for domestic political and strategic gain.
So even if things are relatively quiet on the surface, the potential for a localized incident to be deliberately escalated into something much bigger, drawing in two nuclear powers, remains a constant serious risk.
Precisely. It highlights how easily even so-called verbal conflict or minor clashes between major rivals can, in the wrong circumstances, spill over into material conflict with potentially global consequences.
Okay, we spent a lot of time discussing the decline in negative peace, basically, the presence of violence and conflict.
Yeah.
But the IEP framework also emphasizes positive peace. Let's spend our last few minutes on that. What exactly is positive peace?
Positive peace is about the other side of the coin. It's not just about stopping bombs from falling. It's about building the attitudes, institutions, and structures that actually create and sustain peaceful societies in the long run. Think things like good governance, equitable distribution of resources, acceptance of the rights of others, good relations with neighbors.
The foundations of a stable, functioning society.
Exactly. And the IEP research shows that countries with high levels of positive peace are much more resilient. They're less likely to fall into violent conflict in the first place, and they recover much faster if they do experience shocks.
And one of the key pillars or domains of positive peace that the report focuses on is the free flow of information. Why is that so important?
Well, think about it. Societies where information flows freely, where you have a reliable and independent media, where citizens can access diverse sources of information, these societies tend to be much more stable and peaceful.
Why? How does free information help?
Reliable information supports good governance by holding leaders accountable. It allows markets to function more efficiently because people have accurate data. It fosters trust between citizens and institutions. It allows for peaceful debate and the resolution of grievances through dialogue rather than violence. The correlation between a free flow of information and overall peacefulness in the GPI is very high.
Okay, so free and reliable information is crucial for peace. But the report points to a huge paradox here, right? Especially in the digital age.
A massive paradox. On the one hand, access to information infrastructure has exploded globally. The indicator tracking telecommunications infrastructure, things like internet penetration, mobile phone access, that has improved more than any other single indicator in the Positive Peace Index worldwide over the last decade or so.
So more people are connected, more data is flowing than ever before.
Unprecedented levels of digital connectivity, however, at the exact same time, the quality and reliability of the information flowing through those pipes has plummeted.
How do we know the quality has declined?
The indicators tracking things like press freedom and the perceived quality of information available to citizens show a steep decline globally. The report states that since 2013, 131 countries have recorded deteriorations in press freedom.
131 countries. That's most of the world.
It is, and get this, that includes over 90% of countries classified as full democracies.
90% of democracies have seen press freedom decline. That's stunning. So the digital revolution, this massive expansion of access, hasn't led to a more informed public.
Quite the opposite in many ways. It seems to have simply amplified the spread of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and highly polarized, emotionally charged content. Instead of creating a shared basis of fact for debate, it's often creating fractured realities, eroding trust in established institutions, including the media itself, and making societies more vulnerable to manipulation and division.
So this fundamental disconnect, incredibly high access to information, but increasingly low quality, and trust in that information, this is actually a structural threat to peace and stability.
Yes, particularly to democratic stability. When people can't agree on basic facts, when they're constantly bombarded with inflammatory content designed to provoke anger or fear, it becomes much harder to maintain social cohesion and resolve political differences peacefully.
And this ties into another really shocking finding in the report, the massive bias in how the global media covers conflict. How does what the media chooses to report on or ignore affect things?
It has a huge impact because media coverage directly shapes public awareness, political attention, and crucially, the allocation of resources like humanitarian aid and diplomatic effort.
And the report found the coverage is heavily biased.
Extremely biased. The analysis looked at the number of media articles generated per civilian death across different conflicts and different types of countries. The results were stark.
What did they find?
Civilian deaths occurring in high-income countries received a median of 1,663 media articles per death.
1,600 articles for each death in a rich country. What about poor countries?
Civilian deaths in low-income countries received a median of only 17.4 articles per death.
17, compared to over 1,600. That's
Yeah.
nearly 100 times more media attention per death in a wealthy country.
Exactly. It means that a tragedy of a certain scale in a high-income nation receives vastly disproportionate global attention compared to a similar, or often much larger, tragedy unfolding in a low-income nation.
So the world's attention span is dictated by wealth, not by the scale of human suffering.
Largely, yes. And this has real consequences. Conflicts that are underreported, even if they have immense death tolls, like some of the fighting in Burkina Faso or Ethiopia or parts of the DRC, they simply don't register on the global conscience in the same way. Policymakers face less pressure to act. Aid organizations struggle to raise funds. The victims become invisible.
Is it just an income bias, or is there also a bias towards certain types of conflict that grab headlines?
There's definitely a bias there, too, linked to geopolitical interests. The analysis found that interstate conflicts, that is, wars between two internationally recognized states, which are actually quite rare these days, receive by far the highest media coverage. About 870 articles per civilian death on average.
Okay, so state versus state gets the most attention. What about the more common types?
Those internationalized interstate conflicts, we talked about the proxy wars like in DRC or Syria, which are far more common and often deadlier overall. They receive dramatically less attention. Only about 18 articles about death.
18 versus 870. Again, a massive difference.
It shows that the global media lens is overwhelmingly focused on the great game, the direct confrontations or potential confrontations between established states, particularly major powers. The human cost of the messy, complex proxy battles playing out elsewhere often gets ignored, even if the body count is higher.
And even when the media does cover international relations, it often focuses on rivalry itself, even if it's not violent.
Yes, there's a huge focus on what the report calls verbal conflict, diplomatic spats, trade disputes, political rhetoric between major rivals. The analysis showed the U.S., for example, featured as an actor in 13 of the top 30 most frequently reported interstate pairings, but most of that coverage was about nonviolent disagreements, particularly with Russia and China.
So lots of headlines about U.S.-Russia tensions or U.S.-China trade wars.
Which distracts attention and potentially resources away from the places where people are actually dying in large numbers in ongoing violent conflicts that might be less geopolitically interesting to major news outlets. It's a significant distortion of global priorities. Hashtag outrag outro.
This has been, well, an incredibly detailed and, frankly, quite unsettling look at the state of global peace through the lens of the 2025 Global Peace Index. To try and synthesize the core narrative for you, our listener, what we're seeing is clear. Global peace is declining, and it has been for 6 straight years now. And this decline seems to be driven by these huge systemic forces colliding.
That's right. We've talked about 3 main drivers. First, this accelerating geopolitical fragmentation. We're seeing trust erode, economic interdependence being actively weaponized, and countries globally engaging in a massive, very costly reversal back towards militarization.
Right. Second, there's the immense economic strain that's building up, particularly in developing nations. You've got crippling debt crises, dangerously high youth unemployment, cuts to vital aid, all of which are fueling internal unrest and making states much more fragile.
And the third driver is the changing nature of conflict itself. We're shifting towards this new era of highly complex, often internationalized wars that rarely seem to end decisively. Instead, they become these persistent, frozen conflicts, constantly simmering and ready to re-escalate with devastating consequences. As we've seen so tragically in places like the DRC, it feels like we're at a real structural tipping point.
We really do. And this deep dive into the structural forces really brings us back to that number you mentioned earlier, that almost unbelievable misallocation of global resources.
It really does, because the report calculated that the world is spending $9 trillion every single year just on military expenditure, on containing violence, or preparing for future violence.
$9 trillion.
Yet, the amount we invest globally in peacebuilding, in proactively addressing those root causes of conflict, the economic despair, the political grievances, the things the data clearly shows are fueling the next wave of instability, is only $47.2 billion.
Less than $50 billion for peacebuilding versus $9,000 billion for military spending. It's less than 1% directed at prevention versus containment.
It's a staggering imbalance. And that really leads to the final provocative thought we want to leave you with today.
What if? What if even a fraction of that $9 trillion currently spent preparing for conflict, containing violence, was instead effectively channeled into strengthening those foundations of positive peace, into tackling the debt crisis, investing in youth employment, supporting good governance, funding mediation efforts, addressing the structural factors that this report so clearly identifies as the drivers of instability?
That $9 trillion versus $47 billion gap, it represents a fundamental choice the world is making, perhaps without even realizing it. What could be achieved if that balance shifted, even slightly? It's something to really think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Global Peace Index.
Thank you.